Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Welcome to the MyHorse University and Extension's HorseQuest live webcast titled Bits and Bitting. The presenter today is Dr. Holly Spooner. Holly joined the West Virginia University faculty in 2008 as an assistant professor and extension specialist focusing on equine management. She teaches in the Davis College, which offers a minor in equine management for students who want to learn more about horses or pursue careers within the equine industry. Please note that you are able to ask questions during the presentation via the text chat on the left side of your screen. The questions will be answered by Dr. Christine Skelly. Chris is a co-founder and the director of curriculum for MyHorse University. She is also an associate professor in the Department of Animal Science at Michigan State University. There will also be time at the end of the presentation for additional questions. The presentation from tonight will be recorded and uploaded to our website if you want to review the talk at a later date. And at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Spooner.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening for this webcast, and thanks to MyHorse University and E-Extension for sponsoring these for all of us. This evening, to begin with, I'd like to discuss why we use a bit. As I travel around and do extension meetings and even work with other extension faculty, I find that while many of us have great riding skills, often bits and bitting are one of the more misunderstood factors when it comes to equitation or even horse management in general. So why do we use a bit? When I pose that question at a live meeting, the popular answer that I get is for control. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine capturing up a wild horse, putting a piece of metal in his mouth, and expecting that I'd have control. I think the better answer then is that we simply use a bit as one of our means of communicating with our horse. Obviously, we can communicate with our horse utilizing our voice, our seat, our leg, and then we can communicate through that bit and reins with our hand. It's important to recognize that it's simply an aid for this communication, and we should actually use the bit or use our hand after we utilize our seat and leg, and perhaps even after our voice. We should also realize that we should never utilize a bit for punishment. Now, obviously in the cartoon, this individual doesn't have a lot of control, or he's not communicating very well with his horse. One of the more misunderstood things when it comes to bits and bitting is the definition of a snaffle, or the difference between a snaffle and a curb bit. Typically when I pose this question, the common answer is, well, a snaffle bit is broken in the center. And again, that would be the incorrect answer. A snaffle bit is defined as a bit that utilizes direct pressure. It does not utilize leverage. One of the easiest ways that you can tell if your bit is a snaffle bit is to see if your headstall and reins attach to the same ring. If you'll look here, you can see that the headstall would attach to the same ring that the reins would attach to. With a curb bit, it's going to work in the opposite fashion. A curb bit will utilize indirect pressure, which we often call leverage. The headstall and the reins will attach to two different areas. In this bit, the headstall would attach here, while the rein would attach down here. You can see both of these bits have a broken mouthpiece, yet the bit at the top is a snaffle, while the bit at the bottom is a curb bit. We also have some bits that fall somewhere in the middle. I consider these to be the hybrids. The bit on the left is often referred to as a Kimberwick. If we look closely at this bit, you can see that the reins would attach here, the headstall would attach here, while the reins have these slotted areas on this ring. Thus, the headstall and the reins do not attach to the same ring. However, we could potentially attach our headstall and our rein to the same ring and utilize this as more of a snaffle bit. By the same token, the bit on the right can also be a hybrid, with the headstall attaching here in this fixed area and the rein also having a fixed ring attachment. However, if we attached our headstall and reins loosely to the larger D shape that you see, we would in fact have a snaffle bit. Bits such as these are becoming more and more popular, particularly in our stock breed show realm. It's important to recognize that your particular breed association may have rules governing the usage of these bits and may require that if in fact you do use a fixed rein attachment, that your bit possess a curb chain. We'll now move into the areas where our bit can affect our horse. There are 8 places that we refer to as the places for pressure, or 8 places where your bit or other headgear, as I might put it, will affect your horse. 4 of those are going to be inside the animal's mouth. You can see here that the bars are the area of gummy tissue between the incisors and the molars of the horse. That soft area works out perfectly for us to place a bit in that region without interfering with the teeth, given that the horse has had his wolf teeth removed. We can certainly also affect the corners of the mouth or the corners of the lips. We can affect the tongue as well as the roof of the mouth, depending on our bit of choice. There are 4 other places outside of our horse's mouth where we can apply pressure depending on our bit. The first one being the poll, or the area at the top of the head between the ears, the nose over the top of the face, the curb groove, which is the small area just behind the lumpy portion of the chin, or the side of the face, which is unmarked on here, but would be the area just outside the corners of the mouth, perhaps where your halter ring might rest. Let's look then at what it is that affects the severity of our bits, or the places where these bits can cause action. First and foremost, it's important to remember that the number one thing affecting the severity of your bit is in fact the rider. In the most skillful hands, even what might appear to be the most severe bit can be used with great ease and without causing the horse any pain or discomfort. But give the wrong rider even the most mild bit, and that bit can be painful or cause harm. The next thing that can affect the severity of all bits, and when we say all bits, we're referring to either snaffles or curbs, is the diameter of the mouthpiece. When we're talking about mouthpiece diameter, we're referring to measuring it just inside from the cheek piece on the mouthpiece itself. Typically, when we're looking at the legality of a bit, it's measured 1 inch from the cheek piece. Typically, mouthpiece diameters between 5/16 and 3/4 of an inch are legal for breed associations such as the American Quarter Horse Association. Typically, we consider diameters of mouthpieces around 3/8 of an inch to be moderate. Oftentimes, if the mouthpiece then is larger, we can consider it to be less severe, and the smaller then, the more severe. The smaller diameter is going to place the amount of pressure over a smaller area, thus increasing the pressure in that area and making it more severe. Recognize, however, that too big of a mouthpiece may not always be better. Depending on your horse's conformation of his mouth, in that all of their mouths are not considered equal, some are more shallow than others, we can see that a bigger, fatter mouthpiece may actually apply pressure up towards the roof of the mouth, which may be a different or even a more painful pressure area for that horse. The next thing that can affect the severity of our bits is the texture of the mouthpiece. You can see here that we have a chain-like texture on the bit on the left. This texture is again going to localize the pressure applied to smaller regions, essentially where the small pieces of chain touch the horse's mouth, whether it's his bars or his tongue. In the center, we have what we'd consider to be a twisted snaffle. Again, by adding texture, we're localizing where the pressure is applied and making that pressure over a smaller area and more severe. On the right-hand side, we have a flatter mouthpiece, and if you can see how that lays in the horse's mouth, it would be such that the pressure would be applied along the lower edge here. One of the easiest ways to judge the severity as it is in regards to the mouthpiece texture is simply to run your hand over it and feel how either smooth or rough that might be in your hand. Oftentimes, we consider whether mouthpieces are broken versus solid to have some effect of severity. I would actually argue that perhaps instead of saying this is the severity, it's just instead how the bit will affect the horse. When we utilize a bit with a broken mouthpiece, whether it's a Snapple or a curb, it's going to allow us to have independent lateral control over our horse. Therefore, when I pull on the right rein, he can recognize that it is in fact my right rein or my right hand sending him a signal versus the left side. When we utilize a solid mouthpiece bit like you see below, it is difficult to have that independent movement from one side to the other, or in many ways for the horse to distinguish which rein is being pulled on, as a pull on either side will cause the entire bit to rotate. The fifth thing that can affect the severity of our bits is what we would refer to as the port height or port shape. Now a port is going to be anything that extends above our mouthpiece. This is going to inflict its action by touching the roof of the mouth of the horse. Certainly then, the higher the port, the more severe that bit will be considered. So you see here, this is about a 1-inch port and would be mild to moderate in severity. We could certainly have a much higher port that would be more severe. The port shape is also going to have an effect. When we have a rounded port, again, we're spreading the pressure out over a larger rounded area, versus when we have a more pointed port, such as the cathedral type port that I drew on top of the picture, we're again going to localize that pressure and have that be more severe. Now we have ports, and then we have what we consider to be tongue relief. The mullen mouth type mouthpiece that you see on the right is not actually encountering the roof of that horse's mouth, and instead that shape just allows some room for the horse's tongue to lie underneath it without the bit actually applying pressure to the tongue. Thus, we'd not actually consider that to be a port, and instead would consider it to be tongue relief, and it would actually take away from the severity of the bit. Depending on the horse's mouth conformation, he may be more comfortable in a bit that has more or less tongue relief. The width of a bit should fit your horse. Typically, a bit is a good width when the sides can rest comfortably with about 1/4 inch of mouthpiece visible outside the horse's mouth. If the sides or the shanks of your bit are actually digging into your horse's face, then you're going to need a wider bit. By the same token, if it's too large, you can actually cause a bit, particularly one with a broken mouthpiece, to have what we consider to be a nutcracker effect. Or, because it's too large, you'll see the mouthpiece do this from the shanks and actually jam up into the roof of that horse's mouth. This is a common problem we see in ponies that are wearing too large of a bit in terms of width. When we look at snaffles in particular, this type of snaffle may somewhat influence the severity. You will often see that an egg butt snaffle, the kind with an egg shape here, where the mouthpiece meets the ring in a wide manner, is the gentlest. The D-ring would be somewhat intermediate, and the looser O-ring would be considered to be the harshest. Now when it comes to sending signal to our horse, however, the fact that these O-rings move and are flexible can actually give the horse more time to respond before that harshness is applied, so to speak. Typically, it's not so much the ring shape, but the other factors, such as the width of the mouthpiece out here where it touches the corner of the horse's mouth, that are going to make more of a difference. When we look at the curbs, which I apologize, this should say curb at the top, One of the things that will affect the severity then is the length of the shank. We're going to look both at the overall length, or the measurement from the top ring where the headstall attaches to the bottom ring where our rein attaches, but also the ratio of the top to the bottom, the top being the area from the mouthpiece to this top ring, and the bottom being the area from the mouthpiece to the bottom ring. As we've mentioned, curb bits utilize leverage. The ratio from the top to the bottom will determine how much leverage is applied. So if we compare these two bits, you can see that the top to bottom ratio is going to be less on the bit on the right than it is on the bit to the left. For instance, if we look at the bit on the right, we may have a 1:3 ratio, meaning that the top is 1/3 the distance here at the bottom. If we look at the bit on the left, that ratio may be more like 1:4. Thus, we would have 4 pounds of pressure applied for every 1 pound we apply to the bit on the left, whereas only 3 pounds of pressure would be applied for every 1 pound of pull in the bit on the right. We should also consider the angle of our shank relative to our headstall attachment. And by that, I mean the angle that happens when we draw a line from our top ring to our bottom ring. The more swept back in appearance, such as we see in the grazing bit on the left, the less severe the action of that bit, or the more amount of time it takes between when you pull and when that signal is transferred to the horse. The more vertical, such as the bit that we see on the right, if we draw that same straight line, the quicker or more reactive that bit is going to be. Now, people often ask about designs such as the one you see here on the right. What you'll notice is that design does not actually affect the severity of the bit. We're only concerned about the straight line in between those two rings. So whether or not this flares out, it could come up here in front of the horse, swing back behind it. The only thing that matters is where those top and bottom lines are in relation to one another. Certainly our curb chain can affect our severity. Our curb chain acts in an almost limiting manner, applying pressure to that curb region just behind the chin. The material of the curb chain will affect the severity. We can have materials such as a smooth leather curb, all the way up to a thinner chain curb. The materials will work in the same way such as they do in the mouthpiece, in that the smaller area the pressure is applied over, the more severe that's going to be. Typically, we adjust a curb chain to allow 2 fingers width of space before the curb chain comes into play with the horse. What you'll find, however, is that some horses are more comfortable with pressure in the curb region than others, and they may actually prefer that to be slightly tighter, so that the curb chain then can almost act as a warning before the bit applies pressure elsewhere inside the mouth. Other horses, that's going to be a much more sensitive region, and greater allowance will make the horse more comfortable. Often when we talk about bits, we're asked about the material of the bit. Generally, there are 4 things that we see bits made out of. The first one being steel. Steel bits are heavier and will often rust. Now, rust is not necessarily a concern depending on where it occurs. There are actually some materials that we refer to as sweet iron, which are actually made to have an oxidation or rust-like appearance that the horse actually likes to have in his mouth. Now, of course, if it's your shanks that are rusting and you're trying to show in this bit, that may not work as well. We can also have bits made out of stainless. Certainly the benefit there is that you won't have that rust. Copper is generally seen in the mouthpiece, and there is a belief that by including copper there, we can increase the amount of salivation, and salivation is a good thing. When it comes to a horse holding a bit in his mouth, it's going to allow that bit to move more freely, and it's generally considered to be a sign of a soft mouth. We can also have bits made from aluminum. These are often quite light. We might see these in some of our advanced Western disciplines where we don't necessarily want the horse to have to carry around a huge piece of hardware, so to speak, in his mouth. Typically, when we look at aluminum, that's not something we're going to recommend to have in the mouthpiece, but anywhere else can certainly be used quite readily. In addition to the bits that we've talked about in terms of snaffles and curbs, there are other hardware or equipment that we can utilize in place of a bit on our horse. The most common of these is referred to as the hackamore. Now, like the bit that comes in both a snaffle and a curb variety, we have two different styles of hackamore. The hackamore is designed to place pressure on the nose or the nose and the side of the face. Often, this is quite easy for the horse to understand because typically, before we ride our horses, we're going to have trained them in a halter, which is also going to apply pressure in that area. On the right, we have the bosel, or the bosel, as you'll often hear it called. And the bosel is going to work similar to our snaffle bit in that it's going to apply a direct pressure. Our head stall would attach here. Our reins would be tied in this region. When we pull then, we're going to apply pressure across the nose of the horse. Because it's more of a direct pressure, it's easy for the horse to understand. The bosel is somewhat like the snaffle bit, and you will often see young horses ridden in these. Part of this is part of the Spanish vaquero tradition, where horses were worked in the bosel during the time when they had a lot of changes going on in their mouth in terms of teeth being lost and coming back in during that 2 to 3 to 4-year-old period. On the left then, we have what we consider to be a mechanical hackamore. Mechanical hackamore would be more like the curb bit in that it utilizes leverage. The head stall of the mechanical hackamore would attach here, and the rein would attach here. So again, we have attachment on 2 different rings versus attachment on 1 ring in the bosel. When we pull back, we see that we're utilizing leverage in the mechanical hackamore across the horse's nose. Mechanical hackamores may also be outfitted with a curb chain design, such as what you see here. When looking at bosels, the same aspects come into play in terms of severity. We should be concerned with the material in terms of how big of an area is it applying pressure over. Is it smooth versus rough? We should also look at the length of shank if we're talking about a mechanical hackamore. You can see in the mechanical hackamore in the picture that the nose piece is a bicycle chain type material, which would be quite severe. Fortunately though, it's covered in a smooth plastic that's going to make that less severe. Some important safety factors I find it valuable to mention, as they're often overlooked, is that when we utilize a snaffle bit, it is important to utilize a head stall with a brow band. Now obviously this is taken care of if you're riding in an English discipline, but many of our Western disciplines utilize single or double ear head stalls. Now when you pull back, or pull on your reins in a snaffle bit, the action is such that the top of the head stall here will actually loosen. If the horse decides to take that moment to look down at the ground or swing his head downward, your head stall can actually go over the top of your horse if you don't have that brow band and throat latch in place. One of the other issues that I see is failure to utilize some kind of a bit hobble. A bit hobble may look like a curb chain on a snaffle bit, and people often think, well, the snaffle bit doesn't apply pressure in the curb region. Why do I need this? This bit hobble works in the same way as a full cheek snaffle might work. It's there to keep the bit from being pulled through the horse's mouth should you pull hard on one rein or the other. Doing so at the moment when the horse gapes his mouth open will actually pull the entire bit through his mouth if that bit hobble is not in place. While we didn't talk about it, the full cheek snaffle, which will have a metal bar here, will serve a similar purpose. The full cheek snaffle can also put pressure on the sides of the horse's face when you're pulling, which may give him some additional guidance to turn. I'm often asked, how do you select a bit? The first key is to consider your horse and rider combination. How are your rider's hands? This is extremely important, particularly when considering children riding. Oftentimes, we may ride our horse, jump down, throw our young rider on in that same bit combination. However, the younger rider may balance off their hands more or not be as skilled when it comes to sending those communications to the horse's mouth. So you must consider how soft or how harsh those riders' hands are. You certainly also want to consider how broke is your horse and what is it going to take to send him the proper communication. We certainly want to make sure we know the rules if we're participating in an organized breed show or perhaps a 4-H competition. Most of those are going to specify which styles of bit can be used for horses. It may be dependent upon the class you're looking to show in or the horse's age. If you're going shopping for a bit, I'd suggest taking those rule books with you, as well as bringing a tape measure for measuring things such as shank length, which may have a maximum, or perhaps even the diameter of the mouthpiece. When we're looking at a bit for a horse, we want to make sure we take only small steps and really utilize only what we need in terms of severity. For instance, we'll often start our horses in a moderate diameter smooth snaffle bit. There may be a time when the horse is tough on that or is hanging on that bit to where we need to go up to something a little bit more severe, perhaps a slow twisted wire snaffle. The mistake people make is that they'll move up to that harsher bit and then ride in that bit for an extended period of time. Your goal should always be to go back down to that softer, less severe bit. When you're selecting a bit, quality always pays off. Certainly, you're going to be able to find bits at all price points. Everything from maybe that $5 Tom Thumb type bit, all the way up to bits that are works of art and may cost even several thousands of dollars. While I'm not suggesting you pay that, I do think that investing in quality always pays off. How do you tell if a bit's a high quality? One of the main things is it will have smooth edges. If you run your hands over the mouthpiece or over the areas where the mouthpiece attaches to the shank, you should find that to be smooth. There should be no rough welds or imperfections in the metal in that region. If it's a bit that has a joint, those joints should be tight and should not have gaps where perhaps the corners of the horse's mouth or his tongue could be pinched. Your bit should also have a balanced feel. If you lay it in the palm of your hand, it should balance in such a way that it would hang in the horse's mouth. It should not feel heavier to one side or want to tip forwards or backwards. All of those things are going to be signs that you've selected a quality bit. Typically, your quality bits can be bought as affordably as $20 to $30. It's very difficult to find those extremely cheap bits that are in a high quality. At this point in time, I'd like to answer any questions that you may have. One of the questions I see in the chat is which type of bit is typically recommended for starting a young horse. Typically, we would start our younger horses in either the hackamore, or the boselle more specifically, or in a snaffle type bit. Personally, I prefer to start my horses in a snaffle, as most of them will progress to being shown in a snaffle at some point in time. You can certainly do things such as line driving your horse on the ground with the snaffle bit to get them used to giving and yielding to that pressure in their mouth before you ever climb aboard. But typically a snaffle bit is where we'll begin. Most of our younger horses are shown in those bits. If you ride the English discipline, you're fortunate in that those bits may be all that horse needs throughout the course of his life. Another question I see is, if you use a snaffle bit with the bit hobble, can that replace the brow band? Those actually work for two different purposes. The brow band and the throat latch are going to keep basically the headstall from falling off your horse. Trying to find a picture here that might better illustrate this. As we pull back, our headstall going up over the top of our horse will loosen with the snaffle bit. With the curb bit, because of the leverage, it will actually tighten and apply pressure at the pole. So with that snaffle, when that bit or when that headstall actually loosens, if the horse ducks his head or takes his nose towards his chest, the whole headstall can swing over his ears and fall off if that brow band and throat latch are not in place. That bit hobble, or what appears to be the curb chain type thing on your snaffle bit, actually serves the purpose of keeping the bit from pulling sideways through the horse's mouth. Now, as we mentioned, that bit hobble may not be necessary if you're utilizing a half cheek or a full cheek type snaffle. Another question I see is a 4-year-old horse that's ready to start neck reining and to be moved from a snaffle to a shank bit. Again, quite a common question. And typically, one of the bits you often see referred here is what we'd consider to be a tom-thumb type snaffle. A tom-thumb is actually a straight-sided, short-shanked, broken mouthpiece curb. It might resemble this here if instead of having a mullen mouth, we would have a straight, broken in the center mouthpiece. Now, this is often referred because people will say it's a snaffle or that it's close to a snaffle. I would argue against that in that the straight sides of the tom-thumb snaffle are going to make it quite reactive quickly. And I'd actually prefer to ride my horses during that transition in something that has more of a swept back shank because that's going to make it less reactive. But certainly a broken mouthpiece, if that's the snaffle your horse is accustomed to, is a great place to start. And then again, something with a shorter shank length is going to be less severe. But remember, of course, that it's your rider's hands that are going to have the most effect, and that you should really make sure your horse is quite broke and being able to give and bend and all of those things in that snaffle bit before you progress upwards. Don't make the transition just because your horse has reached a certain age. Another question we see is, what would we suggest for a horse that gets his tongue over the bit and perhaps a mullen mouth? Oftentimes a horse getting his tongue over the bit is a matter of how the bit is adjusted. Typically when we look at bit adjustment up and down in the horse's mouth, what we'll see is that we're often recommended to have one wrinkle in place. Some horses, that one wrinkle may actually put the bit quite high and tight in his mouth, whereas others that may still be low. So different horses are going to have different conformations to their mouth, and you may need to just play with that and try different adjustments based on how your horse is carrying it. Typically though, if he's getting his tongue over the bit, that's a sign that it's too low in his mouth. Whereas if he's continually trying to pick the bit up with his tongue, that may be a sign that it actually needs to go higher in the mouth. Another question that I see involves the use of a French snaffle. A French snaffle, let's see if we can find a good picture here, refers to a bit that instead of being broken in one place in the horse's mouth, actually has two joints, or often what we'd consider a dog bone type shape in the middle. This is just going to allow the bit to lay a bit differently in his mouth. Typically, the single broken mouthpiece is part of what has that bit provide pressure out here on the corners, whereas if we break it in the center with that French or dog bone type appearance, it's going to make the pressure more over the horse's tongue or over the center of the mouth, as opposed to just localizing it out here at the corners. Certainly some horses are more comfortable with that, whereas others, the tongue is one of the more sensitive regions, to where that's going to cause maybe more fight or more of a disgruntled horse, so to speak. But again, something that some horses certainly may be more comfortable with. If you have a horse that has a lower set to the roof of their mouth, the single bit may be more, or the single break may be more uncomfortable, because as that goes upwards, you may actually be providing pressure there on the roof of the mouth when that's not intended. A question that came up is, what would be the purpose to progress to a harsher bit if the horse responds to a lesser bit? Typically, the softer or the lesser the bit your horse can go around in, that's fine. Oftentimes, though, we require, for instance, the transition from a snaffle to a curb in our Western performance horses, just in that the snaffle is typically ridden two-handed, the curb bit ridden with one hand, and those horses, as a senior horse, need to be shown one-handed to display how broke they are, their manners, etc. So that might be one reason that we need to progress to a different type of bit, not necessarily a harsher bit. One thing that you'll see in the show ring is that folks may show in a slightly harsher bit than what they train on, and that's simply because they're not actually pulling on that horse near as much in the show pen. It may just be a slight lift of the fingers action to send them a signal that will get that message through and communicated. Another question that I see is, how do draw reins affect the severity of the bit? The draw rein is going to give you another way of leverage or a mechanical advantage to actually pull the horse's head downward. One of the biggest issues that I see is the use of draw reins with curb bits. Draw reins should only be utilized with a snaffle bit. It's actually kind of counterproductive and somewhat dangerous to utilize those draw reins with a curb. So certainly if you're going to use draw reins, use those with a snaffle. And again, they'll actually almost force the horse to give his head downward. The pull's going to come down from between his legs or from the sides. But generally, those are going to put that horse into some sort of head carriage. Don't like to say they train a head carriage, because they're actually just putting his head there while maybe you work on something else. Jessica's question of what effect does the thickness of a bit have? Again, if you'll remember, the mouthpiece diameter is often what you're thinking of when you think of the thickness of a bit. It's the measurement here across the mouthpiece. The thinner that diameter, the more severe the bit is going to be, whereas the larger it is, the larger the area the pressure will be distributed over, and the less severe we generally think of that as being. If we get into these huge bits that have maybe greater than a 1-inch diameter, though, we actually can go the other way, and instead of reducing the severity, instead we might be placing severity up in the roof of the mouth, which may cause the bit to be more severe. So typically anything 3/4 of an inch and less is going to be dependent upon, as you go down, will become more severe. Another question specifically regarding barrel racing and which type of bit. Again, the best type of bit for you is simply one that your horse is going to respond to and is going to get you the best results in terms of them yielding to that bit and basically allowing you to have the best communication with them. So, there are some barrel horses, for instance, that can go in a smooth Snapple like you see here. Others are going to be hotter and maybe require something that has a bit more severity to it. Others are going to choose to utilize a mechanical hackamore for those gaming type horses. But again, try to focus less on the discipline and more on how broke that particular horse is, and even things like the conformation of their mouth like we've talked about. Which type of bits would be good for shallow-mouthed horses? Typically with a shallow mouth, you're going to want something that's going to stay away from the roof of their mouth. So if we're talking about a ported bit, a 1-inch port may actually come into contact quickly with that horse who's more shallow mouth, so you may need less of a port. Or if we compare two horses, the one with the shallower mouth, the same bit is going to be more severe with. Those shallower mouthed horses, even what may be actually just that tongue clearance or some room for their tongue to move around, may even actually get up and interfere with the roof of their mouth. So perhaps something that's a bit flatter in design stays closer to the tongue and closer to the bars. If there are no other questions, I think that will conclude. Actually, I see a question coming through. Is there a good way to get a horse to give or flex at the pole? Again, that's a bit more of a training question than a bidding question, but the horse essentially has to learn to give to pressure the same way as if you apply pressure to his side and he moves away from it. Essentially, we're applying pressure in the mouth, and instead of pulling back against that pressure, we're asking him to go the other way and give to that pressure. Typically, our horses need to be able to give to the pressure side to side, so lots of bending and flexing, before they'll actually give their head in a downward fashion. Another question, how do we feel about bitless bridles? Again, if that's what works best for your horse in terms of communicating with him, that's certainly an option for you. Bitless bridle, one of the ways to think of that is that it's similar to a halter type style where it's utilizing pressure over the nose or might crisscross under the chin and apply pressure in that region to the horse. And certainly those are areas we can affect. Bitless bridles might work good on a horse who has maybe had too severe of bits in his mouth in the past or has become scared of something being in his mouth due to maybe an inconsiderate rider or something like that. So it's just going to be another option in terms of the areas where that bit will affect the horse. But certainly an option for some horses. There are others, obviously, that those bitless bridle is perhaps not the answer. Someone else asked the question about a horse chomping constantly on the bit. Typically, we see a horse that's chomping as being somewhat of a nervous behavior. Perhaps there's something going on that the horse is not entirely comfortable with. Certainly a good place to start will be to look at how the bit is adjusted within the horse's mouth to make sure that's comfortable to begin with, to make sure that there's nothing else going on such as wolf teeth. Certainly before we put bits in horse's mouth, we want to make sure that the wolf teeth, which are small molars at the beginning of the set of molars that can actually be painful if the bit applies pressure there, we want to make sure those have been removed by our veterinarian or our equine dentist. But those would be the places I would start with a horse that plays with the bit. There are other things we can utilize. Rollers, if it's a horse who's just messing with the bit because they're a busier minded horse, sometimes the addition of a copper roller, which we didn't really feature in here, but a copper roller could be along the mouthpiece and just gives the horse something to roll their tongue against. Oftentimes that's enough to pacify one of those horses and have them to actually close their mouth around the bit. Question of would an uncomfortable bit change a horse's behavior severely? It certainly could. Obviously, there are a lot of places that we talked about being able to apply pressure, and certainly depending on how we utilize our hands, we can apply a lot of pressure to these sensitive regions. So an uncomfortable bit, or perhaps even using a bit in general with maybe a horse that has some uncomfortable wolf teeth, all of those things can cause a horse to have some severe reactions in terms of his behavior. So, if you make a bit change and you have these drastic reactions, one of the easiest things to do is to switch back to what you were using before and see if that solves your problem. Another question regarding a horse who has been going in a looser ring snaffle, but is becoming a bit tougher, tries to grab the bit, pull it from your hands. Oftentimes that might be a sign that you might need to step up just a bit in terms of severity to recapture that control, so to speak, or just to be able to send a stronger signal to that horse to soften them back up, get them yielding and responsive to the bit. So maybe a transition to a slow twist type snaffle might help you make that transition. But again, try to remember then, once you've made those positive changes, to go back to the softer bit you were using, so that you don't just continue up that spectrum of severity to the point that you're at a point where you can't actually go any further. With that, I'd like to thank you all for attending and supporting our webcast here this evening. And we'd like to encourage you to continue with My Horse University, as well as the great resources available through eXtension.
Okay, thank you. Again, we would like to thank Dr. Spooner for her presentation this evening, and we would also like to thank all of you for participating. The next webcast in this series will be on Tuesday, October 13th, 2009 at 7 p.m. on the topic of optimizing hay feeding and storage. It will be presented by Dr. Krishana Martinson, who is from the University of Minnesota. We also will be presenting a webinar on horse genetics at 11 a.m. on October 21st. The speaker will be Dr. Stephanie Valberg, and the title of the webcast is Applications of Equine Genetics. This webcast will be available for online registration later this week. If you have any questions, contact My Horse University at 517-353-3123 or email us at info@myhorseuniversity.com. For more information, you can visit our website at myhorseuniversity.com as well. Please remember that this webcast was recorded and we will give you access by the end of the week. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a great evening.